Malik Hassan thought he had seen everything in his 30 years of business. The Syrian-American real estate mogul had built his empire from nothing, transforming rundown properties into luxury developments across Phoenix. He trusted no one, questioned everything, and always stayed 3 steps ahead. But when he installed hidden cameras throughout his sprawling desert mansion to monitor his new housekeeper, what he discovered on those recordings would shatter every assumption he had about loyalty, integrity, and the true meaning of wealth. Sarah Williams had arrived at his doorstep with nothing but a worn suitcase and a quiet determination that made Malik suspicious. She had no references from previous employers, no fancy credentials, just calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much hardship. Something about her felt wrong to him. So he did what any successful businessman would do. He watched her every move through a network of concealed surveillance cameras. What those cameras captured over the next 2 weeks would force Malik to confront the most uncomfortable truth of his life. Sometimes the people we trust least are the ones who deserve it most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Malik Hassan stood on the marble balcony of his Phoenix mansion, surveying the endless stretch of desert that surrounded his property like a natural moat. The house was his fortress, 12,000 square feet of imported Italian marble, floor to ceiling, windows and technology that could rival a small corporation's headquarters. Every inch of it reflected his success, his control, his refusal to depend on anyone but himself. At 42, Malik had learned that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Born in Damascus to a family that lost everything in the war, he had come to America at 16 with nothing but ambition burning in his chest. While other teenagers worried about prom dates and college applications, Malik worked 3 jobs and studied real estate law by candlelight in a cramped studio apartment. He had clawed his way from poverty to prominence, and every scar from that journey had taught him the same lesson. People will disappoint you, so don't give them the chance. His business empire, Hassan Properties, now controlled over $200 million in assets across Arizona and Nevada, strip malls, luxury condominiums, commercial complexes. Malik's name was etched into the skyline of Phoenix. He had achieved the American dream that his parents had died believing in, but success had come at a price. The mansion that should have been filled with family gatherings and laughter echoed with emptiness instead. Malik's wife, Rebecca, had left him 3 years ago, taking their twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, with her. "You've built a beautiful prison, Malik," she had said on the day she packed her bags, "but I won't raise our children behind these walls." The divorce settlement had cost him $40 million, but the real price was higher. He now saw his daughters only on alternating weekends, and even then, they felt like strangers visiting a museum. The isolation had become his armor. For months after the divorce, Malik had maintained the massive house by himself, refusing to allow outsiders into his sanctuary. But the desert heat was unforgiving, and the mansion required constant maintenance that even his obsessive attention couldn't manage alone. The pool needed daily cleaning, the marble floors demanded specialized care, and the imported plants in his greenhouse required someone who understood their delicate needs. His business partner, David Chen, had been pushing him for weeks to hire help. "You're running a Fortune 500 company out of a house that's falling apart," David had argued during their last video conference. "The pool's green, there are dust sheets over half the furniture, and yesterday I swear I saw a tumbleweed roll through your living room during our investor call." Malik had resisted, but the breaking point came when his daughters visited the previous weekend. 8-year-old Emma had wrinkled her nose at the musty smell in the house, and Sophie had asked why Daddy's beautiful home looked so sad. That night, After driving them back to their mother's pristine suburban house, Malik had stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror and seen a man who had everything and nothing at the same time. The decision to hire a housekeeper felt like defeat, but it was a necessary one. He had instructed his assistant, Patricia, to find someone discreet, professional, and temporary. "I don't want someone who's going to rearrange my life," he had specified. "Just someone who can make this place livable again." The applications had been disappointing. Overpriced services that wanted to send teams of workers, individuals with demands for benefits and vacation time, people who asked too many questions about his schedule and his privacy. Malik had begun to think he would have to manage alone. When Patricia brought him one final resume, "Her name is Sarah Williams," Patricia had said, sliding the thin folder across his mahogany desk. "She doesn't have traditional references, but she's been cleaning houses independently for 5 years. She's reliable, needs the work, and she's not looking for anything complicated." Malik had scanned the sparse resume. Sarah Williams, age 34, originally from Atlanta. No previous employer contacts, no professional training certificates, just a simple note that she specialized in maintaining large homes and had experience with delicate materials and imported furnishings. There was a gap in her work history from 2 years ago that raised questions, but something about the straightforward simplicity of her application intrigued him. When Sarah arrived for the interview, Malik's first impression was of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. She was average height with dark skin and natural hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her clothes were clean but worn, a pressed white shirt and dark pants that had seen better days. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that reminded Malik of his mother, who had maintained her composure even as their world crumbled around them in Syria. "I don't need someone who's going to gossip or pry into my business," Malik had said bluntly, testing her reaction. "This is a private home, and I value my privacy above everything else." Sarah had met his gaze steadily. "I understand completely. Mr. Hassan, I'm here to work, not to interfere. The house is large, 12,000 square feet, including areas that require specialized cleaning. Marble surfaces, imported wood, delicate plants, a pool that needs daily maintenance. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility?" "Yes, sir. I've maintained houses this size before." Malik had pressed further. "I travel frequently for business, sometimes for days at a time. I need someone who can work independently without supervision. Can you handle that?" For the first time, something had flickered in Sarah's expression. Not fear or uncertainty, but a kind of weary understanding. "Independence isn't a problem for me, Mr. Hassan. I'm used to taking care of things on my own." There was something in her tone, a depth of experience that went beyond housekeeping, that made Malik pause. He had built his career on reading people, on detecting the tells that revealed their true motivations. With Sarah, he sensed layers beneath the surface, but he couldn't quite penetrate them. That both intrigued and concerned him. "The pay is $1,500 a week," he had said, watching for her reaction. "Cash payment, no questions asked about taxes or paperwork. In exchange, I expect complete discretion and reliability." Sarah nodded, without hesitation. "When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. I'll show you around once, and after that you'll be on your own." As she had left that evening, Malik found himself studying her retreating figure through the window. There was something about Sarah Williams that didn't add up. The gap in her resume, the way she had avoided eye contact when discussing her previous work, the fact that she seemed almost too grateful for a job that many would consider demanding and isolating. That night, as Malik reviewed security footage from his business properties, an idea had begun to form. His mansion was already equipped with a sophisticated alarm system, complete with motion sensors and cameras at all entry points. It wouldn't be difficult to expand that system internally to add a few discrete cameras in the main working areas. Not to spy, he told himself, but to ensure his investment was protected. By the time Sarah Williams arrived for her first day of work, Malik Hassan had transformed his home into a surveillance network. High-definition cameras hidden in smoke detectors, motion sensors disguised as decorative elements, audio recording devices embedded in the ventilation system. He told himself it was standard business practice, due diligence on a new employee with questionable references. What he didn't know was that Sarah Williams had secrets of her own, secrets that would soon make his surveillance system capture something far more complex than simple theft or negligence. In trying to protect himself from deception, Malik had unknowingly created the perfect setup to discover a truth that would change not just his understanding of his new employee, but his understanding of himself. As Sarah began her first day in the Hassan mansion, carefully dusting the imported sculptures, in the main hallway, while Malik watched from his office monitors, neither of them could have predicted that this arrangement would become the catalyst for the most important discovery of both their lives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first week of surveillance yielded exactly what Malik expected. Nothing suspicious, but nothing impressive either. Sarah Williams moved through his mansion like a ghost, arriving precisely at 6 a.m. each morning and departing by 4 p.m. without fanfare. She worked methodically, room by room, with an efficiency that bordered on mechanical. Through his hidden cameras, Malik watched her dust, vacuum and organize with the kind of detached professionalism he appreciated in his business dealings. But it was the thing she didn't do that caught his attention. Sarah never lingered in rooms longer than necessary. She didn't open drawers or cabinets that weren't part of her cleaning routine. When she encountered personal items, family photos, important documents left on counters, expensive jewelry carelessly placed on nightstands, she cleaned around them without so much as a curious glance. Most telling of all, she never used her phone during work hours, never made personal calls, never seemed to have any life beyond the walls of his home. Malik found this behavior almost unnaturally perfect, which made him more suspicious, rather, than less. In his experience, people who appeared too good to be true usually were. He began studying the footage more intently, looking for the crack in her facade, the moment when her true motivations would reveal themselves. The mansion had been transformed under Sarah's care. The marble floors gleamed with a luster Malik had forgotten they possessed. The greenhouse flourished as she tended to each imported plant with surprising knowledge of their specific needs. The pool sparkled crystal blue, and the desert dust that constantly threatened to invade the house seemed to retreat before her systematic cleaning routines. His business partner David noticed the change immediately during their next video conference. "Did you hire a miracle worker?" David asked, commenting on the pristine condition of Malik's home office. "This place looks like something out of Architectural Digest again." Malik had merely shrugged, unwilling to admit how much the transformation impressed him. "I hired someone, competent, but competence didn't explain everything he observed." Sarah possessed an almost intuitive understanding of the house's rhythms and needs. She adjusted the greenhouse humidity levels without being told, rotated the imported Persian rugs to prevent uneven sun damage, and somehow knew exactly which cleaning products wouldn't damage the delicate Italian marble surfaces. More puzzling were the small improvements she made without permission. She rearranged the kitchen spice rack for better functionality, adjusted the living room lighting to reduce glare on the television screen, and repositioned several plants to catch optimal sunlight. These weren't the actions of someone simply following instructions. They suggested someone who cared about the space as more than just a job. During his daughter's next weekend visit, Emma had noticed immediately. "Daddy, your house smells like flowers now," she had said, breathing deeply in the main hallway. "And everything looks so shiny and pretty." Sophie had been more direct. "Did you get a new house, Daddy? This one doesn't feel sad anymore." Their innocent observations hit Malik harder than any business setback ever had. Somehow, Sarah had managed to restore not just the physical beauty of his home, but something intangible he hadn't even realized was missing. The mansion felt alive again, welcoming rather than imposing. That realization should have pleased him, but instead it deepened his unease. Why would someone work so hard for a job that paid well but offered no security, no benefits, no future? What was Sarah Williams really after? His investigation into her background had yielded frustratingly little information. The address she'd provided led to a modest apartment complex in a working-class neighborhood of Phoenix. Her previous work history, what little existed, checked out, but revealed nothing substantial. She had no criminal record, no outstanding debts, no digital footprint beyond the most basic social media presence. For someone living in the 21st century, Sarah Williams existed in surprisingly few databases. The breakthrough came during her second week, not through his surveillance system, but through an unexpected encounter. Malik had returned home, early from a meeting, entering through the front door instead of the garage as usual. He found Sarah in the main living room, not cleaning, but standing perfectly still in front of the massive stone fireplace, staring at the family portrait that hung above the mantel. The painting showed Malik with Rebecca and the twins from 3 years ago, back when they were still a family. Rebecca's smile was radiant, the girls were giggling at something off camera, and even Malik looked genuinely happy rather than just successful. It was the only family photo he hadn't removed after the divorce, though he wasn't sure why he'd kept it displayed so prominently. Sarah hadn't heard him enter. She stood there for several long moments, studying the portrait with an expression Malik couldn't quite decipher. There was sadness in her posture, but also something deeper, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "That was taken in Sedona," Malik said quietly, startling her. Sarah spun around, her professional composure snapping back into place instantly. "Mr. Hassan, I'm sorry. It's fine," Malik interrupted, moving closer to study her reaction. "They look happy, don't they?" Sarah's eyes flicked back to the portrait briefly before focusing on the floor. "Yes, sir. They look like a beautiful family." "They were," Malik said, the past tense hanging heavy in the air. "My daughters visit every other weekend now. The house gets pretty quiet between their visits." Something shifted in Sarah's expression, a crack in the carefully maintained distance she kept from her employer's personal life. "Children bring life to a home," she said softly. "Even when they're not here, you can still feel their presence in the spaces they've touched." The observation was unexpectedly perceptive, and it revealed something Malik hadn't seen before. Sarah understood loss. The way she had spoken, the careful tenderness in her voice, suggested personal experience with absence and longing. "Do you have children, Sarah?" The question slipped out before Malik could stop himself, crossing the professional boundary he had established. For a moment, Sarah's carefully maintained composure faltered completely. Pain flashed across her features, raw and unguarded, before she rebuilt her walls. "No, sir, I don't." But the way she said it, the careful control in her voice, told Malik there was more to that story. Sarah Williams had experienced loss, and it was still fresh enough to wound her. That evening, as Malik reviewed the day's surveillance footage, he found himself studying Sarah's face during their unexpected conversation. The pain he had glimpsed was real, deep, and carefully hidden. Whatever had brought Sarah Williams to his door, whatever had created those gaps in her employment history, it involved personal tragedy that she carried like a secret burden. 4. The first time since installing the cameras, Malik felt uncomfortable about his surveillance. Sarah wasn't stealing from him or planning some elaborate deception. She was simply a woman who worked with quiet desperation, who cared for his home as if it were her own, and who carried sorrows she was unwilling to share. The realization that his suspicions might be unfounded didn't comfort him. Instead, it raised new questions that were somehow more troubling than his original concerns. If Sarah wasn't after his money or planning to betray his trust, then what was driving her almost obsessive dedication to her work? What was she running from or toward? As the third week began, Malik found himself watching the surveillance footage, not to catch Sarah in wrongdoing, but to understand her. The cameras he had installed to protect himself had become windows into the life of a woman who intrigued him more with each passing day. He didn't yet know that his surveillance system was about to capture something that would transform his understanding, not just of Sarah Williams, but of the true meaning of loyalty, sacrifice, and human connection. The cameras designed to reveal deception were about to expose a truth so profound it would force Malik Hassan to confront the emptiness of his carefully constructed life. The discovery happened on a Tuesday morning when Malik was supposed to be in Las Vegas, closing a commercial property deal. His flight had been delayed by 3 hours due to a mechanical issue, leaving him stranded at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport with nothing but time and his laptop. Out of habit, he accessed his home security system to check that everything was running smoothly in his absence. What he saw on the monitor made him forget entirely about his upcoming meeting. Sarah was in his private study, a room she had explicit instructions never to enter without his presence. Malik's jaw tightened as he watched her move carefully around his mahogany desk, but instead of rifling through drawers or photographing documents as he might have expected, she was doing something completely unexpected. She was crying. Not the quiet tears of someone overwhelmed by work, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Sarah had collapsed into the leather chair behind his desk, her face buried in her hands, overcome by a grief so profound it seemed to emanate from her very core. The professional composure she maintained so carefully had completely shattered, revealing a pain that was devastating in its rawness. Malik found himself leaning closer to the laptop screen, his anger at the intrusion forgotten in the face of such genuine anguish. Through the security camera's audio feed, he could hear Sarah's broken whispers, though the words were too muffled to understand clearly. She seemed to be talking to someone who wasn't there, her voice carrying the desperate tone of a person seeking forgiveness or explanation. After several minutes, Sarah's sobs gradually subsided. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and seemed to notice something on his desk. A framed photograph Malik kept turned face down, one he never looked at, but couldn't bring himself to put away. Sarah hesitated, then carefully lifted the frame. The photograph showed Malik with his business mentor, Ahmad Nazir, taken just 2 months before Ahmad's sudden death from a heart attack 5 years ago. Ahmad had been more than a business partner. He had been the father figure Malik lost in Syria, the man who taught him that success meant nothing without integrity, that wealth was meaningless unless it served a purpose beyond accumulation. Sarah stared at the photograph for a long time, her fingers tracing the glass over Ahmad's face. Then she did something that made Malik's breath catch in his throat. She pressed the frame against her chest and whispered, clear enough for the microphone to pick up, "I'm so sorry, Uncle Ahmad. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. Uncle Ahmad." The words hit Malik like a physical blow. He sat frozen in the airport, a terminal, passengers bustling around him as the impossible implications sank in. Sarah Williams knew Ahmad Nazir, not only knew him, but had called him uncle, a term of deep respect and affection in their culture. Malik's mind raced through the possibilities. Ahmad had never mentioned having any family in America beyond his immediate relatives. He had been intensely private about his personal life, sharing only fragments of his past, even with Malik, who had been closer to him than anyone. But the raw grief in Sarah's voice, the familiar way she had touched the photograph, suggested a connection that ran much deeper than professional acquaintance. As Malik watched, Sarah carefully returned the photograph to its face-down position and began to clean the study with the same methodical efficiency she brought to every task. But now her movements seemed different, more reverent, as if she were tending to a shrine rather than simply dusting furniture. The flight to Las Vegas was the longest 3 hours of Malik's life. His mind kept returning to that moment of recognition, to the impossible connection between his current housekeeper and the man who had shaped his entire approach to business and life. By the time he landed, he had made a decision that went against every instinct he had developed over 20 years of protecting his privacy. He was going to confront Sarah Williams directly. The property deal in Las Vegas concluded faster than expected, partly because Malik's distraction made him more willing to accept terms he might normally have negotiated further. He caught the first flight back to Phoenix, arriving home just as the sun was setting over the desert landscape. Sarah's car was still in the driveway, a 15-year-old Honda Civic that had seen better days, but was meticulously maintained. Through the windows, Malik could see her moving through the main floor, finishing her daily routine. He sat in his Mercedes for several minutes, gathering courage for a conversation that could change everything. He found Sarah in the kitchen, preparing to leave for the day. She looked up when he entered, and for just a moment he saw surprise flicker across her features before her professional mask slipped back into place. "Mr. Hassan, I wasn't expecting you back so early. How was your trip to Las Vegas?" "It was fine," Malik said, studying her face carefully. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Something in his tone made her stiffen slightly. "Of course, sir." "How did you know Ahmad Nazir?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah's carefully controlled expression crumbled, and Malik saw the exact moment when she realized her secret had been discovered. Her shoulders sagged, as if she had been carrying a tremendous weight and had finally been given permission to set it down. "You have cameras in your study," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I have cameras everywhere," Malik admitted. "But that's not what matters right now. What matters is that you called him Uncle Ahmad, and you apologize for not being able. To save him, I need to understand what that means." Sarah closed her eyes and took a shaky breath. When she opened them again, the professional distance she had maintained for 3 weeks was completely gone, replaced by a vulnerability that made her seem younger and infinitely more human. "Ahmad Nazir sponsored my family's immigration from South Sudan 12 years ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband Marcus and we came here with nothing. Uncle Ahmad, Mr. Nazir, he gave Marcus a job at one of his construction sites. He helped us find an apartment, co-signed, or at least when no one else would take a chance on refugees with no credit history." Malik felt the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed beginning to fall into place. "Go on." Marcus was gifted. He could build anything, fix anything. Uncle Ahmad saw that potential and started training him in construction management. For 5 years, everything was perfect. We had a little apartment, steady work. We were building a life. Sarah's voice began to tremble. "We had a daughter, Zara. She was 3 years old and she was everything to us." The pain in Sarah's voice was so acute that Malik found himself taking a step closer, some instinct to offer comfort, overriding his usual emotional distance. 2 years ago, there was an accident at one of the job sites. A crane malfunction. Marcus was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sarah's composure finally broke completely. Uncle Ahmad was there when it happened. He tried to get to Marcus, tried to help, but the stress, the shock of seeing someone he cared about hurt so badly. He had a massive heart attack right there on the site. The devastating truth hit Malik like a revelation. Marcus and Ahmad died the same day. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. Within hours of each other, and 3 months later, Zara got sick, leukemia. I used every penny we had saved for her treatment, sold everything we owned, but it wasn't enough. She died in my arms at Phoenix Children's Hospital, and I couldn't even afford a proper funeral. Malik stood in stunned silence, finally understanding the grief he had witnessed through his surveillance cameras. The careful way Sarah moved through his home, the desperate gratitude she showed for a job that others might consider beneath them. "So you see, Mr. Hassan," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite her tears, "I didn't come here to steal from you or deceive you. I came here because this house, this work, it's all I have left of the life Uncle Ahmad helped me build. Taking care of your home feels like taking care of his memory." In that moment, Malik realized that his sophisticated surveillance system had captured something far more complex than theft or deception. It had recorded the daily rituals of a woman honoring the dead by caring for the living, someone who had lost everything but refused to lose her dignity or her commitment to the values Ahmad Nazir had taught them both. The silence stretched between them until Sarah spoke again, her voice resigned. "I understand if you want me to leave now. I should have told you about my connection to Mr. Nazir from the beginning." Malik looked at this woman who had transformed his empty house into a home, who had carried her grief with such dignity, who had honored his mentor's memory in ways he himself had never considered. For the first time in years, he felt ashamed, not of Sarah Williams, but of himself. The kitchen fell silent except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of desert wind against the windows. Malik stared at Sarah, processing the magnitude of what she had just revealed. Everything he thought he knew about his situation, about her motivations, about the careful boundaries he had constructed around his life, had just crumbled in the space of a single conversation. "You're not going anywhere," Malik said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "Sit down, please." Sarah hesitated, clearly uncertain whether his words were a kindness or a prelude to more difficult questions. But something in his expression must have reassured her, because she slowly pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Malik moved to the coffee maker, needing something to do with his hands, while his mind processed this new reality. "Ahmad never mentioned you or your family," he said, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. "In all the years I knew him, he never talked about sponsoring refugees." "Uncle Ahmad was private about his charity work," Sarah replied, watching him measure coffee grounds with unnecessary precision. "He said that good deeds done for recognition weren't really good deeds at all. He helped dozens of families over the years, but he never wanted credit for it." This sounded exactly like the Ahmad Nazir that Malik remembered, a man who had given millions to various causes but had insisted his donations remain anonymous, who had mentored countless young businessmen but had never spoken about it publicly. The fact that Sarah understood this aspect of Ahmad's character convinced Malik, more than any documentation could have, that her story was genuine. "Tell me about Marcus," Malik said, settling into the chair across from her with 2 cups of coffee. "What was he like?" For the first time since her confession, a small smile touched Sarah's lips. "He was brilliant with his hands, but terrible with paperwork. Uncle Ahmad used to joke that Marcus could build a skyscraper but couldn't fill out a timesheet to save his life." Her expression grew wistful. He had this dream of starting his own construction company someday, specializing in affordable housing for immigrant families. He said everyone deserves a chance to build something permanent, something that couldn't be taken away. Malik felt a strange pang of loss for a man he had never met, but who clearly shared the values Ahmad had tried to instill in him. Ahmad would have helped him make that dream come true. He was already starting to, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. The week before the accident, Uncle Ahmad had been talking to Marcus about a new project, renovating some older apartment buildings to create quality low-income housing. Marcus was so excited he could barely sleep. The irony wasn't lost on Malik. While he had spent the years since Ahmad's death accumulating wealth and building barriers around himself, Ahmad had been working with Marcus to tear down barriers for others. The contrast made him deeply uncomfortable. After they died, Sarah continued, I tried to hold on to the apartment, but without Marcus's income and with Zara's medical bills piling up, it became impossible. I sold everything we owned, but it still wasn't enough. She stared into her coffee cup as if it held answers to questions she had stopped asking. The hospital social worker helped me apply for assistance programs, but there were waiting lists, bureaucratic delays. Zara couldn't wait. Malik had dealt with enough medical situations during his ex-wife's difficult pregnancies to understand the crushing weight of mounting hospital bills. But he had always had the resources to handle whatever came up. The idea of watching a child suffer while fighting insurance companies and assistance programs was a nightmare he had never had to face. How long was she sick? He asked gently. 14 months. Some days were better than others, but toward the end, Sarah's voice faltered. She was so brave. Even when she was in pain, she would try to make me smile. She loved to draw pictures of the house we were going to have someday, with a big garden where she could plant flowers. The mention of flowers made Malik think of his greenhouse, of the way Sarah tended to each plant with such careful attention. He wondered now if those moments of nurturing were her way of honoring her daughter's memory. Where is she buried? The question slipped out before Malik could consider whether it was too personal. Desert View Cemetery, Sarah said quietly. It's not elaborate, but it's peaceful. I visit her every Sunday after church. Malik knew the cemetery. It was visible. From the highway he took to his office each day, a modest collection of headstones nestled against the desert landscape. He had driven past it thousands of times without giving it much thought, never imagining that it held the grave of a little girl whose mother now tended his home with such devotion. The reason I took this job, Sarah said, meeting his eyes directly, for the first time that evening, wasn't just because I needed the money, though I did. It was because when I saw your address, I realized this was the house Uncle Ahmad used to talk about. He was so proud of what you had accomplished, how you had built something meaningful with the opportunities America had given you. Malik felt his throat constrict. Ahmad had been proud of him? In the years since his mentor's death, Malik had often wondered what Ahmad would think of the empire he had built, the wealth he had accumulated, the isolation he had chosen. He had assumed Ahmad's approval, but hearing it confirmed by someone who had known a different side of the man made it feel both more real and more undeserved. Ahmad talked about me. All the time, Sarah said with a sad smile. He said you were like the son he never had, that you understood not just how to make money, but why making money mattered. He said you had the rare combination of ambition and integrity that could change the world if you chose to use it. The words hit Malik like a physical blow. Integrity. Had he really maintained the integrity Ahmad had seen in him, or had success? And pain slowly eroded it. Looking at Sarah, a woman who had lost everything but still worked with dignity, who honored the dead through service to the living, Malik wasn't sure he could answer that question honestly. I've been watching you through cameras for 3 weeks, he admitted. the confession coming out more harshly than he intended. "I installed surveillance equipment throughout the house because I didn't trust you. I assumed you were here to steal from me or somehow take advantage of my situation." Sarah nodded slowly, as if she had already suspected as much. "I know. I could tell there were cameras in most of the rooms. The placement was too obvious to miss if you knew what to look for." "You knew?" Malik was stunned. "Then why didn't you say anything? Why did you continue working here?" "Because I understood why you did it," Sarah said simply. "Uncle Ahmad told me about what you had been through in Syria, how your family died, how you had to build everything from nothing. When you've lost as much as we both have, trust becomes something precious that you can't afford to give away easily." The casual way she included herself in that assessment, "we both have," made Malik realize that Sarah saw their situations as fundamentally similar. Both refugees in their own ways, both survivors of devastating loss, both trying to build meaning from the wreckage of their former lives. "But you trusted me," Malik pointed out. "You took a job with a stranger, worked, alone in his house, cared for his home as if it were your own." "I trusted Uncle Ahmad's judgment," Sarah corrected gently. "He believed in you, so I believed his belief was worth something. And—" She hesitated, then continued, "this house needed care. I could feel it the moment I walked in. It was beautiful, but empty, like a museum of someone else's life. It reminded me of how I felt after Zara died, still functioning, still standing, but hollow inside." The parallel she drew between his house and her grief was so accurate it took Malik's breath away. His mansion had indeed become a monument to a life he no longer lived, a family he no longer had, success that felt increasingly meaningless. "You brought it back to life," he said quietly. "No," Sarah replied, shaking her head. "I just reminded it what it was supposed to be. A home. Not a fortress or a display of wealth, but a place where people could feel safe and cared for." As they sat together in the warm kitchen light, Malik realized that the surveillance system he had installed to catch Sarah in deception had instead captured something far more valuable, a glimpse of what his life could become if he had the courage to tear down the walls he had built around his heart. The surveillance cameras that had once been Malik's window into suspicion became something entirely different over the following weeks, a mirror reflecting his own transformation. Instead of searching for evidence of deception, he found himself observing moments of quiet grace that challenged everything he thought he understood about strength, dignity, and human resilience. Sarah had returned to work the next morning as if their conversation had never happened, but something fundamental had shifted between them. The professional distance that had defined their relationship was replaced by an unspoken understanding. She no longer avoided his presence when he worked from home, and he no longer felt the need to monitor her every movement through his hidden cameras. What he witnessed instead was a masterclass in living with purpose, despite devastating loss. Every morning at exactly 6 a.m., Sarah would arrive and begin her routine by spending 10 minutes in the greenhouse. Malik watched as she spoke softly to each plant, checking soil moisture, adjusting positioning, pruning dead leaves with surgical precision. But now he understood that these weren't just plants to her. They were living things that depended on her care, much like the daughter she could no longer tend. "The orchids are responding well to the humidity changes you made," Malik mentioned one morning, finding her adjusting the misting system. Sarah looked up, surprised by his presence in the greenhouse. "Your daughter Emma mentioned during her last visit that she loves purple flowers. I thought maybe when the orchids bloom next month she might enjoy seeing them." The casual mention of his daughter's preferences stopped Malik cold. "You remember what Emma said?" "Children's words matter," Sarah replied simply, returning to her work. When someone that young shares what makes them happy, it's worth remembering. This attention to detail extended far beyond horticulture. Malik began noticing small changes throughout the house that he had initially attributed to Sarah's general efficiency, but now recognized as something more intentional. The living room had been subtly rearranged to create better conversation areas. Family photos that had been gathering dust in forgotten corners were now prominently displayed, polished to a shine that made the happy memories seem more vivid. The kitchen, once a sterile showcase of expensive appliances, had been transformed into a space that invited gathering and connection. Most remarkably, Sarah had begun preparing meals and leaving them in containers with heating instructions, despite cooking never being part of her job description. The food was simple but expertly prepared. Dishes that reminded Malik of his childhood in Damascus, flavors he hadn't tasted since his mother's death. "You don't need to cook for me," Malik said one evening, finding a container of stuffed grape. Leaves in his refrigerator alongside a note with warming instructions written in Sarah's careful handwriting. "I know I don't need to," Sarah replied the next morning when he thanked her. "But you're working too much and eating too little, Uncle." Ahmad used to worry about the same thing, successful men forgetting that their bodies need fuel, not just their ambitions. The mention of Ahmad's concern for his well-being created an unexpected tightness in Malik's chest. How many people in his current life noticed whether he was taking care of himself? His business associates cared about his productivity. His ex-wife cared about his reliability with the children, but who actually cared about his well-being as a human being? "Ahmad used to lecture me about work-life balance," Malik admitted. "He said that building an empire was worthless if you didn't have anyone to share it with." "He practiced what he preached," Sarah said with a gentle smile. Every Friday, he would leave work early to have dinner with whatever family he was helping that week. He said that wealth was only meaningful when it created connections, not isolation. This conversation planted a seed that grew over the following days. Malik began leaving his office earlier, spending more time in the common areas of his house rather than hiding in his private study. He found himself looking forward to the casual conversations that arose naturally when he and Sarah occupied the same spaces. These interactions revealed layers of Sarah's character that impressed him beyond her tragic circumstances. She possessed an intuitive understanding of business that surprised him, often making observations about his phone conversations that showed remarkable insight. The investor from Dallas sounded nervous about the timeline, she mentioned one afternoon, after overhearing him discuss a commercial development project. "In my experience, when people are worried about timing, they're usually worried about money they don't want to admit they don't have." Malik paused in his review of the contract documents. "What makes you say that?" Marcus dealt with contractors who made the same verbal patterns when they were cash-strapped, but trying to maintain credibility. The tone gets a little higher. They use more words than necessary to explain simple things, and they keep circling back to reassurances that weren't questioned. Her analysis was startlingly accurate. The Dallas investor had indeed been experiencing financial difficulties, though. They hadn't been disclosed in their formal communications. That's very perceptive. You learn to read people when your survival depends on understanding their true intentions, Sarah said matter-of-factly. When you're desperate, you develop an ability to see past what people say to what they actually mean. This comment reminded Malik that Sarah's insights weren't academic. They were hard-won through experiences that had tested her in ways his privileged upbringing never had. The thought humbled him and sparked a growing respect for her resilience. The real breakthrough came during his daughter's next weekend visit. Emma and Sophie had grown comfortable with Sarah's presence over previous weekends, but this time their interaction revealed something that made Malik reconsider his understanding of his own family dynamics. He was working in his study when he heard unusual sounds from the kitchen. Laughter, multiple voices, the clattering of dishes being actively used rather than simply cleaned. Through his surveillance system, he watched his daughters working alongside Sarah to prepare what appeared to be an elaborate tea party setup. "Miss Sarah, can you show us how to make the little sandwiches with the crusts cut off?" Emma was asking, standing on a step stool beside the counter. "And can we use the fancy plates that Daddy never lets us touch?" Sophie added, eyeing the expensive china that typically remained locked in display cabinets. "Your father's fancy plates are meant to be used for special occasions," Sarah replied, already reaching for the cabinet keys. "And what could be more special than tea with two beautiful princesses?" Malik watched his daughters' faces transform with delight as Sarah treated them not as weekend visitors in their father's house, but as welcomed guests in what had become, under her care, an actual home. She taught them to properly arrange cucumber sandwiches, showed them how to fold napkins into elegant shapes, and listened with genuine interest as they chatted about school, friends, and their various 8-year-old concerns. "Miss Sarah," Emma said during a pause in their preparations, "why doesn't Daddy ever eat dinner with us when we're here?" The question hit Malik like a physical blow. From his study, he could see Sarah pause in her sandwich preparation, clearly choosing her words. "Carefully, your daddy works very hard to take care of you and your sister," Sarah said gently. "Sometimes adults think that providing for the people they love means spending all their time working instead of spending time with them. But the truth is, the people we love need our presence more than our presence." "That's what Mommy says too," Sophie chimed in. "She says Daddy forgot how to be a daddy instead of just being a boss." Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "Maybe your daddy didn't forget. Maybe he just needs someone to remind him that the most important job he has isn't at his office. It's right here with you two." That evening, after the girls had returned to their mother's house clutching leftover tea party treats, Malik found Sarah cleaning up the kitchen. The fancy china was being carefully washed and returned to its cabinet, but the joy that had filled the room seemed to linger in the air. "Thank you," he said simply. Sarah looked up from drying a delicate teacup. "For what?" "For showing them what this house could feel like, for treating them like they belong here instead of like visitors." "They do belong here," Sarah replied with quiet conviction. "This is their father's home. That makes it their home too, whether they live here full-time or not." Standing in his kitchen, watching Sarah restore order after an afternoon of genuine family connection, Malik realized that his surveillance cameras had captured something far more valuable than he had ever imagined possible. They had recorded not just the transformation of his house, but the slow, careful reconstruction of his capacity to trust, to connect, and to hope for something better than the isolated fortress he had built around his wounded heart. 3 months into Sarah's employment, Malik made a decision that would have been unthinkable when he first installed his surveillance system. He disabled the cameras, not all of them. The exterior security system remained active for legitimate safety reasons, but the internal monitoring network that had turned his home into a fishbowl was quietly shut down. The irony wasn't lost on him that in trying to watch Sarah more closely, he had ended up examining his own life under a microscope and finding it wanting. The house felt different without the constant electronic observation. Conversations became more natural, interactions less guarded. Sarah seemed to sense the change immediately, though she never mentioned it directly. Instead, she began sharing small details about her day, observations about the neighborhood, stories about the various characters she encountered at the grocery store or the bank. "Mrs. Patterson next door asked if you were feeling all right," Sarah mentioned one morning while preparing his coffee. "She said she's been hearing laughter from your house on the weekends and wanted to make sure you weren't having some sort of breakdown." Malik nearly choked on his breakfast. Laughter is A sign of breakdown in Mrs. Patterson's world. Apparently, she's lived next to you for 4 years and never heard anything but the sound of your home office printer and the occasional business call, Sarah replied with a slight smile. The tea parties with Emma and Sophie have created quite a stir in the neighborhood gossip network. The idea that his home had been so devoid of joy that laughter seemed abnormal to his neighbors was both embarrassing and enlightening. How had he allowed his life to become so sterile, so disconnected from basic human happiness? This reflection deepened when Sarah made an unexpected request on a Friday evening. "Mr. Hassan, I know this is outside my normal responsibilities, but I was wondering if I could ask for a favor," she said, appearing in his study doorway with an uncharacteristic hesitancy. "Of course. What do you need?" "Tomorrow is the anniversary of Zara's death. I usually spend the day at the cemetery, but this year I'd like to do something different, something she would have enjoyed." Sarah paused, gathering courage. "I was hoping I could bring a few friends from my church to see the greenhouse. Zara always dreamed of having a garden, and I thought maybe sharing the beauty you've created here might be a way to honor her memory." The request was so unexpected, so personal, that Malik found himself momentarily speechless. Sarah was asking to bring strangers into his private sanctuary, to share something that had taken him years to perfect. His immediate instinct was to refuse. The greenhouse was his space, his retreat, not a community gathering place. But looking at Sarah's face, seeing the vulnerable hope in her expression, Malik realized that this request represented something much larger than a simple favor. It was an invitation to let his carefully maintained isolation serve a purpose beyond his own protection. "How many people are we talking about?" he asked. "Maybe 8 or 10 from the congregation. Most of them are older ladies who've been praying for me since Marcus and Zara died. They've never seen anything like your greenhouse. It would bring them so much joy." The idea of elderly church ladies invading his pristine home should have horrified him. Instead, Malik found himself curious about the community that had supported Sarah through her darkest hours, the people who had formed a safety net when her entire world collapsed. "What time tomorrow?" he heard himself asking. Sarah's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. "Really? You'd be comfortable with that?" "I think it's time this house served a purpose beyond just impressing business associates," Malik said, surprising himself with the admission. "What time should I expect everyone?" The next morning, Malik found himself unusually nervous as he prepared for Sarah's guests. He had hosted countless business meetings, entertained potential investors, given presentations to rooms full of skeptical financiers, but the prospect of welcoming a group of church ladies felt somehow more daunting than any boardroom negotiation. They arrived in a caravan of modest vehicles, 8 women ranging in age from 60 to 80, dressed in their Saturday best despite the casual nature of the visit. Sarah introduced each one by name, sharing brief stories that revealed the depth of their care for her. Mrs. Coleman, who had driven her to every doctor appointment during Zara's illness. Miss Betty, who had organized meal trains when Sarah was too exhausted to cook. Mrs. Washington, who had helped her navigate the maze of insurance paperwork and hospital bureaucracy. "Ladies, this is Mr. Hassan," Sarah said, her voice carrying a warmth and pride that made Malik stand a little straighter. "He's the one who made all this beauty possible." What followed was 2 hours unlike anything Malik had experienced in his carefully controlled adult life. The women moved through his greenhouse with wonder and genuine appreciation, asking informed questions about growing conditions, sharing stories about their own gardening experiences, offering practical advice about plant care that came from decades of nurturing living things. "This jasmine reminds me of my grandmother's garden in Mississippi," Mrs. Coleman said, breathing deeply near a climbing vine. She used to say that flowers were God's way of showing us that beauty could grow anywhere if you gave it enough love and attention. Miss Betty, the group's apparent botanical expert, spent 20 minutes discussing soil pH levels with Malik, demonstrating a knowledge of horticulture that rivaled his expensive consultants. "You've got a gift for this," she told him approvingly. "Most rich folks I know just pay someone else to make things pretty, but you actually understand what these plants need to thrive." But it was Mrs. Washington, a dignified woman in her 70s, who made the observation that would stay with Malik long after the visit ended. "Sarah talks about you all the time," she said quietly, while the other women admired his prize orchids. "She says you're like the son Ahmad Nazir never had, that you've got a good heart buried under all that success and suspicion." Malik felt heat rise in his cheeks at the idea that Sarah discussed him with her friends. "She's very kind. Kindness has nothing to do with it," Mrs. Washington replied firmly. "That girl has been through hell and back, and she's learned to see people's true nature because her survival depended on it. If Sarah Williams says you're a good man, then you're a good man, even if you've forgotten it yourself." The visit culminated in an impromptu prayer circle in the greenhouse, with the women joining hands around a memorial planter that Sarah had quietly created for Zara, a small arrangement of purple flowers that she tended with special care. Malik stood awkwardly at the edge of the circle, unsure whether his presence was welcome in such an intimate moment. "Join us," Mrs. Coleman said gently, extending her hand toward him. "You're part of this family now, whether you realize it or not." As he took her weathered hand and bowed his head, while Mrs. Washington offered a prayer of gratitude for Zara's brief life and Sarah's continuing strength, Malik felt something shift inside his chest. These women, who had so little in material terms compared to his wealth, possessed something he had spent years trying to buy: genuine community, unconditional support, the kind of belonging that money couldn't purchase. After the group departed, leaving the greenhouse filled with lingering warmth and the echo of genuine laughter, Malik found Sarah sitting quietly beside Zara's memorial planter. "Thank you," she said simply. "They'll be talking about this for months. You gave them something beautiful to remember." "They gave me something too," Malik replied, settling into the chair beside her. "I can't remember the last time my home felt so alive." Sarah looked around at the greenhouse, at the carefully tended plants that had brought such joy to her friends, at the space that had been transformed from a private retreat into a place of shared wonder and community connection. "This is what Uncle Ahmad always talked about," she said softly. "He used to say that the purpose of success wasn't to build walls around yourself, but to create something beautiful that could be shared with others. Today, you honored his memory better than any business deal ever could." As they sat together, in the warm afternoon sunlight filtering through the greenhouse glass, surrounded by the living testament to care and patience that Malik had cultivated, he realized that his surveillance cameras had failed to capture the most important transformation of all: his own evolution from a man who hoarded his blessings to someone beginning to understand the joy of sharing them. The phone call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night in November, jarring Malik from the first peaceful sleep he'd enjoyed in months. Sarah's name appeared on his caller ID, and his heart immediately began racing. In the 6 months she had worked for him, Sarah had never called outside of business hours, never crossed the professional boundaries they had carefully maintained, despite their growing friendship. "Mr. Hassan, I'm so sorry to wake you." Sarah's voice was strained, barely controlled by panic threading through her usual composure. "I didn't know who else to call." Malik sat up in bed, instantly alert. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "I'm at Phoenix General Hospital. There was a fire at my apartment building tonight. I'm okay, but—" Her voice broke slightly. "Everything's gone. Everything I had left of Marcus and Zara, all the photos, her drawings, the quilt my mother made before she died, it's all gone. The words hit Malik like a physical blow. He had seen Sarah survive poverty, grief, and isolation with quiet dignity. But there was a raw desperation in her voice now that cut straight through to his core. The woman who had lost her husband, child, and mentor with such grace was finally breaking under the weight of losing the last tangible connections to her former life. "Where are you right now?" Malik asked, already getting out of bed and reaching for his clothes. "The hospital lobby. They brought everyone here to check for smoke inhalation. The Red Cross is supposed to help with temporary housing, but they're overwhelmed tonight. There were 3 apartment fires across the city and—" Sarah's voice trailed off into exhausted silence. "Stay exactly where you are," Malik said firmly, pulling on his shoes. "I'm coming to get you." "Mr. Hassan, you don't need to—" "Sarah." His voice carried a tone of authority that brooked no argument. "You called me. That means you trust me to help. Let me help." The drive to Phoenix General took 25 minutes through empty streets, giving Malik time to process the magnitude of what had happened. Sarah's apartment had been more than just her residence. It was the repository of her memories, the physical evidence of the life she had built with Marcus and the brief, precious time she had shared with Zara. Now, all of it was reduced to ash and smoke. He found her in the hospital lobby, sitting alone on a plastic chair with a Red Cross blanket draped around her shoulders. Her clothes smelled of smoke, her face was streaked with soot, and her eyes held a hollowness that reminded him of his own reflection in the months after his divorce. She looked like someone who had finally run out of strength to keep fighting. "Come on," Malik said gently, helping her to her feet. "Let's go home." "I don't have a home," Sarah said quietly, the simple statement carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Yes, you do," Malik replied with certainty that surprised even him. "You have a home with me." The drive back to his mansion passed in silence. Sarah stared out the window at the desert landscape, lost in thoughts too private to share. Malik found himself stealing glances at her. This woman who had transformed his empty house into a sanctuary, now stripped of everything that had anchored her to her own past. Back at the house, Malik led Sarah to the guest room she had occasionally used during late-night cleaning sessions, or when weather made the drive to her apartment impractical. But as she stood in the doorway, clutching the hospital blanket like armor, he realized that offering her temporary shelter wasn't enough. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I want you to know that this isn't charity. This isn't me feeling sorry for you or trying to repay some debt. This is me asking you to stay because this house needs you, and frankly, so do I." She turned to look at him, confusion and exhaustion warring in her expression. "Mr. Hassan," "Malik," he corrected gently. "If we're going to be housemates, I think it's time you called me Malik." For the first time since the phone call, Sarah smiled, a small, fragile expression that didn't quite reach her eyes, but suggested that maybe, despite everything, hope wasn't entirely lost. The next few days revealed the true extent of Sarah's loss. The apartment fire had been caused by faulty wiring in a building that should have been condemned years earlier. 16 families had lost everything, but most of them had relatives or resources to fall back on. Sarah had neither. The insurance coverage on her belongings was minimal, covering little more than basic necessities. What devastated her most weren't the material losses, but the irreplaceable personal items. The hand-drawn pictures Zara had made during her hospital stays, the wedding photo of her and Marcus taken at the courthouse on the day they became American citizens, the recipe book her mother had brought from South Sudan filled with measurements and instructions written in 3 different languages. "I know they were just things," Sarah said one evening as they sat in the kitchen over dinner. a meal she had insisted on preparing despite Malik's protests that she didn't need to work. But they were the only proof I had that my family existed, that we were happy once. Malik understood that particular pain more intimately than Sarah realized. After his parents died in Syria, he had spent years mourning not just their deaths, but the loss of every photograph, every letter, every physical reminder of his childhood. The difference was that he had rebuilt his life in America with new memories, new relationships. Sarah's losses were complete and final. "Tell me about the recipe book," Malik said, an idea beginning to form. Sarah's face softened as she described her mother's careful handwriting, the way certain pages were stained from years of use. The stories behind each dish that connected her to a heritage she feared was now lost forever. Over the following week, Malik embarked on a project that consumed his evenings and weekends. Using his business connections and resources, he began what he privately called Operation Memory Recovery. He hired a genealogy specialist to research Sarah's family history. He contacted the refugee resettlement agency that had helped her family immigrate, gathering documentation and photographs from their files. Most significantly, he reached out to members of Sarah's church congregation, many of whom had known her during happier times. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Coleman mentioned that she had taken several photos at Marcus and Sarah's citizenship ceremony, pictures she had never thought to share because she assumed Sarah had her own copies. Miss Betty revealed that she had written down several of Sarah's mother's recipes years earlier, when they had cooked together for church potlucks. Mrs. Washington had kept every thank you note Zara had drawn for the congregation during her illness. Tiny works of art that captured a little girl's gratitude and creativity. The project culminated 3 weeks after the fire, when Malik presented Sarah with something that made her cry for the first time since that desperate phone call from the hospital lobby. It was a memory book, professionally bound but filled with personal treasures. The photos from her citizenship ceremony, carefully restored and enlarged. The recovered recipes, beautifully transcribed, and accompanied by stories from church members who remembered sharing meals with Sarah's family. Copies of Zara's drawings, donated by the hospital staff, who had kept them as reminders of a brave little girl who had brightened their difficult work. But the centerpiece was something Malik had commissioned from a local artist, a portrait based on the one family photo that had survived because Sarah kept it in her wallet. It showed Marcus, Sarah, and 3-year-old Zara in their small apartment, captured in a moment of ordinary happiness that now seemed impossibly precious. "I can't replace what you lost," Malik said, as Sarah turned the pages with trembling hands. "But I wanted you to have proof that your family existed, that they were loved, that their memory is honored by everyone whose life they touched." Sarah clutched the book to her chest, tears streaming down her face, not the desperate grief of fresh loss, but the cleansing tears of someone who had been given back a piece of herself she thought was gone forever. "Why?" she whispered. "Why? Would you do all this for me?" Malik thought about the surveillance cameras that had started their relationship, about the walls of suspicion and control he had built around his life, about the loneliness that had seemed like strength until Sarah showed him the difference. "Because you taught me that taking care of people isn't just about providing for their physical needs," he said quietly. "It's about honoring their stories, preserving their memories, helping them remember who they are when the world tries to erase them." As Sarah held the memory book and wept tears of gratitude rather than despair, Malik realized that his journey from surveillance to trust had led him to something he had never expected to find again, the profound satisfaction of using his resources not to protect himself from others, but to heal the wounds that life had inflicted on someone who deserved so much better than she had received. 6 months after the fire, Malik Hassan stood in his home office, the same room where he had once monitored Sarah through hidden cameras, preparing for the most important business presentation of his life. But this wasn't about profit margins or market expansion. This was about legacy, purpose, and honoring the memory of a man who had believed in second chances. The presentation material spread across his desk told the story of the Ahmad Nazir Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping refugee families rebuild their lives in America. The centerpiece project was an affordable housing development in partnership with the city of Phoenix, 48 units designed specifically for immigrant families, complete with community gardens, childcare facilities, and job training programs. The zoning committee approved the final permits this morning, David Chen said over video conference, his excitement evident even through the computer screen. Construction can begin next month. Are you sure you want to fund the entire first phase yourself? Malik glanced toward the kitchen, where he could hear Sarah preparing dinner while humming softly a sound that had become the heartbeat of his home. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The foundation represented a complete transformation of Malik's understanding of success. Instead of accumulating wealth for its own sake, he had begun using his resources to create the kind of opportunities Ahmad Nazir had provided for Sarah and Marcus. The housing development would be just the beginning. He had plans for scholarship programs, small business loans for immigrant entrepreneurs, and a mentorship network connecting established professionals with newcomers struggling to navigate American business culture. But the most profound change wasn't in his philanthropy. It was in the daily rhythms of a life that had been rebuilt around connection rather than isolation. Sarah had officially become more than his housekeeper months ago, though neither of them had ever formalized the transition. She was his partner in the foundation work, using her hard-won understanding of refugee challenges to guide program development. She was his daughter's favorite person, the one who remembered every school event and soccer game, who helped with homework and listened to their 8-year-old concerns with the seriousness they deserved. Most importantly, she had become the sister he had never had, the family member who saw through his wealth and success to the frightened boy from Damascus who still occasionally woke up afraid that everything could disappear overnight. The evening of the foundation announcement, Malik hosted a dinner party, the first social gathering his home had seen since his divorce. The guest list included the church ladies who had welcomed him into their community, several of the refugee families he had met through Sarah's connections, his business partners, and even his ex-wife Rebecca, who had expressed cautious optimism about the changes she had observed in him during recent custody exchanges. "I have to admit, I'm shocked," Rebecca said quietly, as they watched Emma and Sophie help Sarah arrange flowers in the greenhouse. 2 years ago, I couldn't get you to attend a single school function. Now, Sarah says you haven't missed one in 4 months. I learned the difference between being a provider and being a father, Malik replied, watching his daughters laugh as Sarah taught them to braid jasmine stems into crowns. Sarah showed me that presence is more valuable than presents. Rebecca followed his gaze to where Sarah was patiently adjusting Emma's flower crown, her face radiant with the kind of joy that comes from nurturing without expecting anything in return. "She's good for you, for all of you. She saved my life," Malik said simply. "I just didn't realize I needed saving until she showed me what living actually looked like." The formal announcement of the Ahmad Nazir Foundation took place in the main living room, with 30 guests gathered around the fireplace where the family portrait still hung. But now it was joined by newer photos that told the story of an expanded definition of family. Pictures of Sarah with the girls at their school science fair, group shots from the church ladies' regular greenhouse visits, professional photos from foundation planning meetings that showed Malik in settings he would never have imagined 2 years earlier. Ahmad Nazir believed that America's greatest strength was its ability to transform tragedy into opportunity. Malik began, his voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. He sponsored dozens of families like Sarah's, not because he expected anything in return, but because he understood that helping others rebuild their lives was the highest possible use of success. He looked around the room at faces that represented his new understanding of wealth, not just financial resources, but the richness that came from community, connection, and shared purpose. The foundation will ensure that Ahmad's vision continues, that families fleeing violence and poverty will find not just shelter in America, but the chance to build dreams they thought were impossible. Sarah, who had been quietly emotional throughout the presentation, stood up when Malik finished. "If I may," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had drawn him to trust her in the first place. "I want to tell you what this foundation really means to people like me." She spoke about the desperation of arriving in a new country with nothing but hope, the crushing weight of bureaucracy and cultural barriers, the kindness of strangers who chose to see potential instead of problems. "Uncle Ahmad didn't just give my family money or a job," she explained. "He gave us dignity. He treated us like people with something to contribute rather than charity cases to be pitied." Then she turned to Malik, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And Malik has honored that legacy by creating something that will help hundreds of families experience that same dignity. This foundation isn't just about housing or job training. It's about helping people remember that they are worthy of dreams, worthy of building something beautiful from the ashes of what they lost." The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but Malik barely heard it. He was thinking about the surveillance cameras that had started this journey, about his desperate need to control and monitor everything around him. That paranoid, isolated man felt like a stranger now, someone he had once been but could never be again. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the dishes were cleaned, Malik found Sarah in the greenhouse tending to Zara's memorial. Planter. The purple flowers were in full bloom, vibrant against the dark desert night visible through the glass walls. "I've been thinking about something," Sarah said without looking up from the plants. "When I first started working here, you watched me through cameras because you didn't trust me. Now you're trusting me with a multi-million-dollar foundation. What changed?" Malik considered the question seriously. "I think the cameras showed me the wrong person's true nature," he said finally. "I was so busy looking for your flaws that I ended up seeing my own." Sarah smiled, the expression warm in the greenhouse's golden light. "Uncle Ahmad used to say that the people we're most suspicious of are usually reflecting something we don't like about ourselves. Maybe you saw something in me that reminded you of who you used to be before success made you afraid." "Maybe," Malik agreed. "Or maybe I saw someone who had lost everything but hadn't lost her ability to hope, to care, to trust. And I realized I wanted to be that strong." They stood together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the plants that had become symbols of patience, growth, and the possibility of beauty emerging from careful tending. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars. But inside the greenhouse, inside the home they had built together, everything felt abundant and alive. "There's something I need to tell you," Malik said, his voice carrying a weight that made Sarah look up from the flowers. "The cameras are all gone now, every single one, but even if they were still there, they couldn't capture the most important thing that happened in this house." "What's that?" "A lonely, suspicious man learned how to be part of a family again, and it happened because someone who had every reason to distrust the world chose to trust him instead." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable in their early days, but now felt as natural as breathing. "Thank you for giving me a place to heal," she said quietly, "and for letting me help you heal too." As they turned off the greenhouse lights and walked back toward the house, their home, their sanctuary built on trust instead of surveillance, Malik realized that the cameras had ultimately served their purpose. They had revealed the truth, just not the truth he had expected to find. He had installed them to catch a stranger in deception. Instead, they had captured a broken man's journey back to wholeness, guided by a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to trust again, even after the world has given you every reason not to. The mansion that had once been a fortress of isolation had become a foundation for community. The surveillance system designed to keep others out had somehow opened the door to let love back in. And the man who had once believed that protection meant distance had discovered that true security came from connection, commitment, and the revolutionary act of caring more about someone else's well-being than his own safety. In the end, the cameras had shown Malik exactly what he needed to see. Not Sarah's secrets, but his own capacity for transformation. Not her flaws, but his own potential for grace. Not evidence of deception, but proof that trust, once given freely, could bloom into something beautiful enough to change two lives forever. 1 year after the Ahmad Nazir Foundation's launch, Malik found himself standing in the community center of the new housing development, watching something he had never imagined possible. The space buzzed with activity as dozens of families, Syrian refugees, Sudanese immigrants, Honduran asylum seekers, Afghan interpreters who had fled after the American withdrawal, worked together, preparing for the first annual Unity Festival. The festival had been Sarah's idea, inspired by her mother's stories of village celebrations in South Sudan, where different tribes would come together to share food, stories, and hope for the future. Community isn't just about living in the same place, she had explained to the foundation board. It's about creating traditions that bind people together across all the things that usually divide them. Malik watched 12-year-old Amara, whose Somali family had arrived 6 months ago, teaching origami to Mrs. Patterson's grandchildren, are the same neighbor who had once been suspicious of laughter coming from his house. The transformation wasn't limited to the refugee families. The entire surrounding neighborhood had been drawn into the foundation's orbit, creating connections that transcended economic, cultural, and generational boundaries. The health clinic opened its doors yesterday, Dr. Jennifer Martinez reported, appearing at Malik's side with a clipboard full of enrollment forms. We already have 47 families signed up for services, and the dental program has a waiting list. The partnership with Phoenix General is working better than we hoped. The clinic represented Phase 2 of the Foundation's mission, recognizing that stable housing was meaningless without access to health care. Dr. Martinez, a second-generation Mexican-American physician, had joined the foundation board after treating several refugee families in the emergency room and witnessing firsthand the barriers they faced in accessing preventive care. More importantly, Dr. Martinez continued, we've recruited 3 medical interpreters from within the community itself, people who understand not just the language barriers, but the cultural fears and misconceptions that prevent families from seeking help. This community-based approach had become the foundation's signature. Rather than imposing solutions from outside, they identified and empowered leaders from within the refugee populations themselves. Sarah had been instrumental in developing this philosophy, drawing on her own experience of feeling diminished by well-meaning charity that treated recipients as problems to be solved rather than people with solutions to contribute. The success had attracted national attention. The following week, Malik was scheduled to testify before a congressional subcommittee on immigration policy, sharing the Foundation's model as an example of private sector solutions to refugee integration challenges. It was an opportunity he would have pursued aggressively 2 years ago, seeing it as validation of his business acumen. Now, he viewed it primarily as a platform to amplify voices like Sarah's that rarely reached such influential audiences. "Nervous about Washington?" Sarah asked, joining him as they watched the festival preparations. She carried baby David, the 6-month-old son of Fatima and Hassan, a young Syrian couple who had arrived speaking no English and were now both enrolled in the community college's nursing program. "Not nervous exactly," Malik replied, accepting the baby when Fatima approached to help with the festival setup. "More concerned about representing everyone's stories accurately. These families have trusted us with their experiences, and I don't want to reduce their complexity to sound bites that make politicians feel good about themselves." This concern reflected how profoundly Malik's relationship with success had evolved. Where he once measured achievement in deals closed and profits maximized, he now evaluated impact through stories like Hassan's, a former Damascus engineer who had spent 2 years working construction before the foundation's job placement program helped him secure a position with the city's infrastructure department. "You'll do fine," Sarah assured him. "You've learned to listen before you speak, which is more than most people accomplish in a lifetime." The observation carried weight because it came from someone who had witnessed his complete transformation. Sarah now served as the Foundation's Director of Community Engagement, a role that utilized her unique combination of lived experience, cultural competency, and instinctive understanding of what different families needed to thrive. Her work had expanded far beyond the original housing project to include a small business incubator, adult education programs, and a mentorship network that paired established professionals with newcomers navigating American workplace culture. The evening's most significant moment came during the festival's opening ceremony, when Ahmad Nazir's widow, Layla, made her first public appearance since her husband's death. Malik had maintained a respectful distance from Ahmad's family, honoring their privacy while building the foundation, but Layla had requested to attend after learning about the scope of the work being done in her husband's name. Ahmad would have been so proud, she said, her voice carrying across the packed community center, not just of the buildings or the programs, but of how you've honored his belief that America's strength comes from welcoming the stranger and helping them become neighbors. She paused, her gaze finding Sarah in the crowd. He often spoke of the families he helped not by name, but by their courage, their determination to rebuild after losing everything. He said that sponsoring refugees wasn't charity, it was an investment in America's future, because people who have survived the worst and still choose hope are exactly the kind of citizens any country should want. The applause was respectful but subdued, the audience understanding they were witnessing something sacred, a widow's public blessing of work that extended her husband's legacy in ways he never could have imagined. After the ceremony, Malik found himself in conversation with Maria Santos, whose Honduran family had arrived 8 months earlier, fleeing gang violence. Maria worked as a cleaner during the day, but attended the Foundation's evening English classes and had just passed her GED examination. "My daughter wants to be a doctor," Maria said, gesturing toward 15-year-old Isabella, who was helping serve food with the confidence of someone who belonged. "Before we came here, I told her to make smaller dreams. Now I tell her to dream bigger than she thinks possible." This shift in generational expectations represented perhaps the Foundation's most profound success. Children who had arrived traumatized and educationally disrupted were now thriving in school, participating in extracurricular activities, planning for college futures that seemed realistic rather than fantastical. The transformation wasn't just individual, it was reshaping how their parents understood American possibilities. "The ripple effects are already showing in the second year," Sarah explained to a reporter from the Washington Post who was covering the festival. We're seeing refugee parents become advocates for their children's education, starting their own businesses, running for school board positions. They're not just integrating into existing communities, they're strengthening and expanding what community means. The reporter, clearly impressed by the scale of transformation he was witnessing, pressed for specifics about replication in other cities. This question had become increasingly common as other philanthropists and policymakers sought to understand whether the Foundation's model could be scaled nationally. The key isn't replicating our exact programs, Malik interjected. It's replicating the principle of treating refugees as assets rather than burdens, of investing in their potential rather than just managing their needs. Every community will need different solutions, but every community can benefit from the energy and perspective that newcomers bring. As the festival wound down and families began the slow process of cleaning up, Malik reflected on how dramatically his understanding of success had expanded. The foundation had directly served over 200 families in its first year, but the indirect impacts were immeasurable: children who would grow up bilingual and bicultural, businesses that would be strengthened by diverse perspectives, neighborhoods that would be more resilient because of their interconnectedness. Ready to head home? Sarah asked, finding him as he helped fold tables and stack chairs. Home. The word carries a different meaning now than it had 2 years ago. Home wasn't just the mansion they shared, though that remained their sanctuary. Home had become this community center, the foundation offices, the network of relationships that stretched across the city and connected families from dozens of countries through shared experiences of loss, hope, and mutual support. As they drove through the quiet desert streets toward the house where their journey together had begun, Malik realized that the surveillance cameras that had started everything had ultimately captured the most important truth of all. Real security came not from watching others with suspicion, but from building communities where everyone had reason to look out for each other. The cameras were gone, but the trust they had inadvertently helped create had grown into something neither he nor Sarah could have imagined: a foundation that was changing not just individual lives, but the very definition of what it meant to call America home. 2 years after testifying before Congress, Malik Hassan stood in the arrival terminal of Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, holding a sign that read "Williams Family" in both English and Arabic. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same man who had once installed surveillance cameras to monitor a desperate woman seeking work was now personally welcoming her nephew's family as they fled violence in their homeland. Samuel Williams, Sarah's brother-in-law, emerged from the customs area with his wife Miriam and their 3 children, carrying the same worn suitcases and shell-shocked expressions that had marked every refugee family Malik had encountered over the past 3 years. But Samuel's story was different. He was coming to America not as a stranger seeking charity, but as family returning to family. "Uncle Samuel," Sarah called out, her voice breaking as she rushed forward to embrace the brother of her late husband. Marcus. The reunion was tearful and joyful, a moment of healing for Sarah, who had believed all connections to her former life were severed. Samuel's arrival marked the 5th anniversary of the Ahmad Nazir Foundation, which had grown from a local housing project into a national model with satellite programs in 12 cities. The foundation's success had attracted a $50 million federal grant to expand their integration services, but more importantly, it had spawned dozens of grassroots organizations led by former refugees who understood both the challenges and possibilities of starting over in America. "The numbers tell one story," Malik explained to the documentary crew from 60 Minutes who had spent the week filming at various foundation sites. "We've directly served over 1,500 families, helped establish 43 small businesses, and seen 312 children graduate high school with college acceptances. But those statistics don't capture what we've really accomplished. The documentary, titled From Surveillance to Sanctuary, would air the following month, introducing the Foundation's work to a national audience at a time when immigration debates dominated political discourse. The producers had been particularly interested in the personal transformation aspect of how a wealthy businessman's paranoid surveillance of his housekeeper had evolved into a movement that was reshaping American attitudes toward refugees. What we've really accomplished, Malik continued, is proving that America's greatest strength isn't our wealth or our military power. It's our capacity to see potential in people that others have written off, to create opportunity where others see only problems. This philosophy had been tested repeatedly as the Foundation expanded. Not every success story was straightforward. Some families struggled with cultural adaptation, some businesses failed, some young people made choices that disappointed their parents' sacrifices. But the Foundation had learned to measure success not by perfection, but by resilience. The ability to support families through setbacks while maintaining hope for breakthrough moments. The most profound vindication of this approach came through Emma and Sophie, now 12 years old and completely bilingual in English and Arabic, thanks to their immersion in the Foundation's community. The twins had become natural ambassadors for the refugee families, organizing fundraisers at their private school, tutoring younger children in English, and serving as cultural interpreters when their father traveled to Washington for policy meetings. "Dad says we're living proof that diversity makes everyone stronger," Emma explained to the documentary cameras with the earnest confidence of someone who had grown up seeing difference as normal rather than threatening. When you grow up with friends whose families come from everywhere, you learn that there are lots of different ways to be American. Their mother, Rebecca, had been initially skeptical of their involvement in Foundation activities, concerned about exposing them to stories of violence and displacement. But she had gradually become one of the program's most effective advocates, organizing donation drives among Phoenix's professional community and serving on the Foundation's board of directors. The girls are learning empathy and global citizenship in ways that no classroom could teach, Rebecca admitted during her own interview segment. And frankly, seeing Malik become the father I always knew he could be has been worth the years of difficulty we went through. The personal reconciliation between Malik and Rebecca hadn't led to romantic reunion, but it had created a co-parenting partnership that prioritized their daughter's well-being above past grievances. More importantly, their collaboration on Foundation work had shown Emma and Sophie that adults could work together constructively even after relationships ended, providing a model of mature conflict resolution that would serve them throughout their lives. Sarah's role had evolved far beyond her original position as Community Engagement Director. She now served as the Foundation's Chief Operating Officer, overseeing a staff of 47 people across multiple cities. Her office walls were covered with photos from families she had helped transition to American life, children's drawings thanking her for assistance, and letters from young adults who had received Foundation scholarships and were now attending universities across the country. The most rewarding part isn't the individual success stories, though those matter enormously, Sarah reflected during her segment of the documentary. It's watching entire communities transform their understanding of what's possible. When a Somali grandmother starts an after-school program in her apartment complex, or when a Syrian engineer runs for city council, they're not just improving their own situations, they're expanding everyone's idea of who belongs in America. This community-level transformation had attracted attention from academic researchers studying social integration patterns. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from Arizona State University had been following Foundation families for 3 years, documenting how refugee integration affected broader neighborhood dynamics. What we're seeing challenges traditional assimilation models, Dr. Rodriguez explained in her research presentation to the Foundation Board. Instead of newcomers simply adopting existing cultural patterns, we're witnessing genuine cultural synthesis, established residents learning new languages, trying new foods, developing friendships across ethnic lines. The Foundation's neighborhoods are becoming more connected, more resilient, and frankly more interesting than comparable areas without refugee populations. This research had practical implications for urban planning and community development policies, suggesting that strategic refugee resettlement could revitalize declining neighborhoods while providing newcomers with affordable housing and established support networks. The Foundation's influence extended internationally as well. Malik had been invited to speak at refugee conferences in Geneva, Berlin, and Toronto, sharing the American model with countries struggling to integrate their own displaced populations. The fundamental principles treating refugees as assets rather than burdens, empowering community leadership, focusing on long-term integration rather than short-term assistance, had proven adaptable across different political and economic contexts. The irony is that I started this work thinking I was helping people who needed me, Malik reflected during the documentary's final interview, conducted in the greenhouse where he and Sarah had shared so many pivotal conversations. But every family we've worked with has taught me something essential about resilience, hope, or the meaning of home. I'm not the same person who installed those cameras 5 years ago, and I wouldn't want to be. The greenhouse itself had become a symbol of the Foundation's approach, not just providing shelter, but creating beauty, fostering growth, requiring patience and care. The memorial planter for Zara had grown into a small garden section where families could plant flowers or vegetables from their countries of origin, creating physical connections to heritage while putting down roots in new soil. Sarah joined him in the greenhouse for the documentary's closing segment, both of them surrounded by the thriving plants that had witnessed their journey from suspicion to partnership to something approaching family. People ask me what I've learned from this experience, Sarah said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had drawn Malik to trust her years earlier. The most important lesson is that healing happens in the community. Individual therapy, personal reflection, private grief all have their place, but real transformation happens when broken people choose to help other broken people, when survivors use their pain to prevent others from suffering alone. The documentary crew packed up their equipment as the sun set over the Phoenix desert, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded Malik of his childhood in Damascus. The cameras that had once divided him from Sarah were being replaced by cameras that would share their story with millions of Americans, potentially inspiring similar transformations in communities across the country. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't installed those surveillance cameras? Malik asked as they walked back toward the house, their footsteps echoing in the quiet evening air. Sarah considered the question seriously. I think we would have found each other eventually, she said. People who need healing and people who can provide it tend to recognize each other, even through walls of suspicion and fear. The cameras just made the process more dramatic. As they reached the front door of the home they had built together, not just the physical structure, but the life of purpose and connection it represented, Malik realized that Sarah was probably right. The surveillance system had been a symptom of his isolation, not its cause. The real transformation had begun the moment he chose to see Sarah as a person rather than a problem, to trust her story rather than his suspicions. The cameras were gone, but their legacy lived on in every family the Foundation had helped. Every child who would grow up believing that home was wherever people chose to welcome you. Every community that had learned to measure wealth not by what they could accumulate, but by what they could share. In the end, the discovery that changed everything wasn't captured by any surveillance system. It was the simple, revolutionary realization that the strangers we fear most are often the family members we haven't recognized yet, and that true security comes not from watching others, but from building a world where everyone has reason to watch out for each other. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.